You pulled the trigger. Was it murder or justified self-defense? The answer hinges on the precise legal definition of deadly force, force likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. Justification for using this level of force requires a reasonable belief that the force is immediately necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury to the actor. Critically, the defense is generally unavailable if the actor could have safely used non-deadly force. The three core elements of self-defense involving deadly force are necessity, proportionality, and a reasonable belief regarding the threat's imminence. The burden of proof typically rests on the prosecution to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt once the defense raises the issue. These boundaries determine whether you walk free or face a homicide charge. The threat justifying deadly force must be imminent, meaning immediate and impending, not future or past. Most jurisdictions apply a mixed standard for evaluating the defendant's state of mind. First, the defendant must subjectively believe the use of deadly force is necessary. Second, that subjective belief must also be objectively reasonable under the circumstances. An honest but unreasonable belief in the necessity of deadly force constitutes imperfect self-defense. Imperfect self-defense is not a complete defense, meaning it does not lead to acquittal. However, in jurisdictions that recognize the doctrine, imperfect self-defense may mitigate a charge of murder down to voluntary manslaughter. The force used in self-defense must always be proportional to the threatened harm. Deadly force is never justified solely to counter a threat of non-deadly force, even if that non-deadly force constitutes a battery. If the defendant uses force grossly disproportionate to the threat, the defense fails entirely. In such a case, the defendant legally becomes the aggressor, forfeiting the right to self-defense. Furthermore, the defendant must cease using force once the threat has been neutralized or the attacker has clearly retreated. Any continued use of force after the threat has ended is considered criminal assault or battery. An individual who initiates a confrontation, known as the initial aggressor, generally forfeits the right to claim self-defense. The initial aggressor can regain the right to self-defense only under two specific conditions. First, the aggressor must completely withdraw from the confrontation and clearly communicate that withdrawal to the original victim. This communication must be unambiguous. Second, the aggressor may regain the right if the original victim escalates the fight using deadly force when the initial aggression was non-deadly. If the victim responds with disproportionate deadly force, the initial aggressor may then use deadly force in response to protect themselves. Jurisdictions are split regarding whether a defendant has a duty to retreat before using deadly force. The minority rule requires a defendant to retreat if a safe avenue of escape is readily available. This duty to retreat has a major exception, the Castle Doctrine. Even in minority jurisdictions, the defendant is not required to retreat if they are in their own home. The majority rule, often called the true man rule, holds that a person lawfully present in a location has no duty to retreat whatsoever. Under the true man rule, if the defendant reasonably believes deadly force is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury, they may stand their ground and use that force. The Castle Doctrine is a critical exception to the duty to retreat, permitting the use of deadly force without retreat when the defendant is in their dwelling. This exception applies universally, even in minority jurisdictions that otherwise require retreat outside the home. Stand your ground laws adopted by many states significantly expand this concept. These laws eliminate the duty to retreat in any place where the defendant is lawfully present, provided the defendant is not the initial aggressor. Stand your ground statutes often grant immunity from prosecution or civil suit if the use of force is later determined to be justified under the law. Defense of others is justified when the defendant reasonably believes the third party would be legally justified in using deadly force in self-defense. Most jurisdictions follow the reasonable belief rule. Under the reasonable rule, the intervener is justified even if they are mistaken about the necessity of force, provided that mistake was objectively reasonable. A minority of jurisdictions follow the alter ego rule. Under the alter ego rule, the intervener steps into the legal shoes of the victim and is only justified if the victim was actually justified in using force. Crucially, deadly force is never justified solely for the defense of property. The Model Penal Code permits the use of deadly force when the actor believes such force is immediately necessary to protect against death, serious bodily injury, kidnapping, or sexual assault. The Model Penal Code standard for retreat is narrower than the common law minority rule. It requires retreat only if the actor knows they can avoid the necessity of using deadly force with complete safety by retreating. The Model Penal Code also allows for imperfect self-defense based on the actor's culpability regarding their mistaken belief. A reckless belief in the necessity of force reduces murder to manslaughter. A negligent belief in the necessity of force reduces murder to negligent homicide.